Hey Cycle 1 TPAers, welcome or welcome back to TPA Cafe. This is our final video in our hot tips series, which is going to be step 4 apply. And much like step 3 reflect, step 4 apply sometimes stumps candidates because it seems like it's again kind of just a narrative reflection of what went well or what you'll do next and everything, but it's actually really asking for you to deliver strong claims and concrete evidence and data and citing from your previous steps about what really went well and why, and what you'll do next and why, and what would you do differently and why. And one of the most common words I will see for people that get twos that come into remediation is vague. And vague is not a word that you want associated with your TPA in any way, shape, or form. So in this video, I'm going to give you 3 hot tips for how to kind of avoid the scores of 1s and 2s and get more into that 3 range or higher. So the hot tips in this series are going to be I'm going to do it a little differently. So I'm going to give you kind of the hot tip for question number 1, and then I'm going to give you the hot tip for question number 2, and then I'm going to talk to you about questions 3 and 4. So rather than giving you like concrete for all of this document, this is what you should do, I'm going to kind of take you through the specific questions because there are specific things that happen with the specific questions that will help you kind of avoid certain things and then be able to get into the score range that you want. So, and I have, again, the template in front of me so that I can kind of talk to you about the specific questions. So question number 1 is, based on your planning, teaching, assessing, and checking for understanding and reflecting, do you need to reteach any part of the lesson content, why or why not? So what you need to do for this question is you need to not, first of all, you need to not be vague. So a vague response would be, you know, I taught the lesson, it went well, I don't think I need to reteach it. My students pretty much demonstrated the content goals, so voila. That's vague, and we want to avoid that. You want to think about your answers like a multi-layered cake, any flavor of your choosing. You know, it's like when someone cuts into a cake and it has a bunch of layers and you're like, ooh, amazing. You know, your responses need to be multi-layered like that, where it's not just like, yeah, this was great. It needs to be like, you know, based on all of the, you know, the specific teacher moves that I did, I don't feel like I need to reteach any part of the lesson. And then you need to give the data as to why. Why don't you feel like, you know, through the teaching, through the assessing, through certain teacher moves that you did, the planning that you did, what was helpful, what worked, what did, you know, that kind of a thing. Like, you want to give very specific examples from different parts of your lesson around like this worked and here's the data and here's the data. 28 out of 30 of my students demonstrated my learning objective. They did great on this section, which was here. This is why I think they did well. Here are the things that I did in my lesson that I feel like worked for them in terms of them demonstrating the learning goals. Multi-layered responses as to, do you have to reteach or not? If you do need to reteach, you still want to give multi-layered responses as to, I do feel like I need to reteach because I feel like, you know, while this part went really well, I feel like this part could have gone better. I feel like I didn't elicit as higher order thinking from my students. You can cite back, you should be citing back to your previous steps again, like step 3. So in your planning, your videos, your reflection, citing back to this went well and why, I feel like I need to reteach and this is why. Just give the evidence. You want to make sure that you're giving lots of evidence for whatever decision that you're making, giving specific things that happened in the lesson, teacher moves, instructional strategies, the ways you check for understanding, do you need to reteach or not, and why. Give lots of evidence. So that's hot tip number 1. Hot tip number 2 has to do with question number 2, which is, if you were to teach the lesson again, what would you do the same or differently? Now, this is not what will you teach next time. This is, if you were to do the same lesson over again, what would you do the same or differently and why? 2, and there are 2 parts to this. There is to improve higher order thinking and deep learning of content. So we'll start there. So first of all, you need to focus your response on the higher order thinking component and deep learning of content. What would you do the same and why? Like, what are the specific things that worked and why would you do them again? What would you do differently to elicit more higher order thinking and why. So whatever you respond in terms of higher order thinking, you need to make sure that you are actually addressing, like, the things that you say you're going to do will actually elicit more higher order thinking. So if you say like, oh, I'm going to lecture more to students, they're going to say, well, that's not going to elicit higher order thinking. So you need to make sure that whatever you talk about that you're going to do differently to improve higher order thinking is actually going to improve higher order thinking. Okay. So I know that seems really basic, but it is a reason that people get called out on this particular section of the things that the candidate says that they're going to do differently is not going to really benefit the students in XYZ ways. So you need to make sure that what you say you're going to do the same, why did it work? What you say you're going to do differently, how would it improve higher order thinking? And then the same goes for part B, which is how will you support the academic language if you were to do this same lesson again. What would you do the same or differently to support academic language and ELD for your whole class and your 3 focus students? Again, what would you do the same in regards to academic language and ELD, and why? What worked? What about it worked? Be very specific. What would you do differently and why? And make sure the things you list you would do differently will actually improve the academic language and ELD for your whole class and 3 focus students. Just be really specific and make sure your answers are aligned. Wherever you have the opportunity to cite back to the previous steps in your TPA as evidence for your responses, do that. And again, like I said in step 3, reflect, just make sure that your responses and the citing that you're doing is actually supporting the claims that you're making in step 4. So hot tip number 3 is actually about question number 4 on this template, but I just want to quickly touch on question 3. I do see a lot of teaching candidates do a great job with this question because they do talk about it's in the next content specific lesson, how you will highlight or how you would highlight or change the instruction to further affirm or validate your students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds for the whole class and your 3 focus students. And so people do tend to kind of do a deep dive into, like, if you felt like you could have done a little bit more in terms of validating students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds in your lesson, you know, a lot of times it's a great opportunity to reflect about what you would do differently to further do that. So that's pretty straightforward, and I feel like people do a relatively strong job at that on this template. The last thing that trips people up is the 4th question on here, which is based on what the whole class of students learned about the content and the academic language you were teaching, what would you do next? What will you teach next? And so you just want to make sure, hot tip number 3, this is so important. And you did this allegedly in your 3rd video where you closed the lesson by stating next steps for learning and why you're doing the next thing that you're doing. It's kind of like you're going to put that down on paper now. So, excuse me, you want to make sure that the next thing that you're doing is, so first of all, you want to make sure that you're stating, like, based on the fact that my students demonstrated the learning goals of ... and they did this and they did that and they got this and they demonstrated this academic language and they did this really well, and giving really good data about the lesson today. Based on the fact that they could do all of these things, what I will teach next is X and Y. So what will you teach next? It needs to be building on the lesson from today. It needs to be connected to the lesson from today. If you're going to teach something that I've actually seen in certain TPAs, not very often, but I read a TPA recently that actually, where the teaching candidate actually said, what I'm teaching next actually doesn't have to do with the lesson today. That's the opposite of what they want to hear. They want to hear, what I'm doing next is building on this lesson in this way. Like, it's going to extend the students' learning from today, and here's how. It's building in rigor from the lesson today. It's connected. It has to be building on and connected to the lesson from today. So it's if it's the next thing, like an example they gave in our TPA coordinator meeting was, like, if you're teaching adding fractions with common denominators, just an example, then maybe the next time you're going to be building on this by teaching subtracting fractions with common denominators, where you're still keeping that core, that common ground of the common denominator, but then you're building on it with subtracting, and they're learning a new skill from the basis of the skill they learned today. Something like that. And so, but you want to really have a good grasp on, here's what I'm teaching next based on what they learned today, and here's why I'm teaching it. And you want to make sure that you're very intentional about, you know, why you're teaching the next thing, you know it's building on the lesson today, and you know it's because your students demonstrated your learning goals from today. That's it. But I know it sounds simple again. simple, yet these are the small changes that I advise candidates to make when they come to me in remediation because they got 2s. And so I want you to preemptively kind of look at these videos and do these things ahead of time so that you can try to avoid getting those 2s, or hopefully not 1s, but getting those 2s where you could get 3s on all of the Cycle 1 rubrics for your Cycle 1 CalTPA. So friends, I hope you found this series helpful. I loved filming it for you. If you did, I'd love it if you'd give these videos a like, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone that you think would benefit from it, and I will see you all in the next video.